We are in the third chapter, Vibhuti-pada. And in this chapter, Patanjali talks about extraordinary knowledge, experiences, and powers which are attained on the way. They are not the goal of Patanjali or his 8-step process, but if you follow it sincerely on the way, these experiences and powers, they happen, or you can see them, or you can know them, even if not possess them. The type of extraordinary knowledge, powers, experiences Patanjali refers to, from a psychoanalytic standpoint, would be called just as pure fantasy or psychosis. But Patanjali is very sure, and so are many who believe in him. And I, for one, do believe that the present limits of human potential need not be the absolute eternal limits of human potential. And so, the promise that this shows is, or at least presents to us is, as a possibility, that the limits of human potential are far away from where we are. And there is a long way to go. But this chapter also brings in an element of philosophical orientation and belief. Positively viewed, it looks like the science of future. Critically viewed, looks like fantasy and psychosis. I, for one, don't approach Patanjali as an expert approaches an expert. I approach it more as a student approaching a teacher. So in that sense, I believe, although I have not experienced what Patanjali says, some of the powers he talks about, in fact, I have not seen anybody possessing those powers. Yet I don't feel any reason to disbelieve that as a possibility, a rare possibility, it may be there. So, because I have not experienced much of what is there in the third chapter, not I have met people who have directly experienced it themselves, commentary is much lesser in the third chapter. In the fourth chapter, it will again go back to the regular measure. So let us go and see what Patanjali has to say further. One 27, doing Sayama on the features of the body and consolidating the energy so generated and decoupling it from light, one can attain the power to go invisible. So everything depends on this master technique of Sanyama. And what is Sanyama? We have seen Patanjali defined Sanyama as a combination of dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. Concentration, oneness, and the state of no thought. All of them focused on a particular objective or an object. How that is done, I had said before, I have not yet done it. So I don't really have much to share on this. But in times to come, I'll try to practice it whatever extent I can and come back with my experience on this. From a psychoanalytic standpoint, it just looks like a fantasy or psychosis. Similarly, he says, you can understand the ability to make sound disappear or be unheard of by other people. So he talks about in 27, in 127 and 128, the 127 is about power over light and 128 is about power over sound. In power over light, we also see it in Sri M's autobiography, where his guru stopped the light from reflecting back from his body for a few seconds. And during the few seconds, the disciple Sri M could not see the body of his master. So we do see a living confirmation even today of somebody who says he has had experience when somebody demonstrated the power over light. So there is no reason to disbelieve that this rare power cannot exist, because we still have people very authentic and living who talk about these things. One 129. One 129 again goes back to karma. He says there are karmas which bring results swiftly or slowly. If you put attention, if you do sanyama on this karma, karmas which bring attention swiftly, karmas which bring attention slowly, look at what is the difference between them, focus upon it, and do the sanyama. One can have the knowledge and the foreknowledge of one's death, as well as knowledge about omens and foretelling signs. So, sanyama on karmas which bring swift results, karmas which bring slow results, the difference between them, sanyama on that difference, all of this will enable one to have foreknowledge of one's death. And it is very similar to one sutra before, which talks about sanyama on one's innate characteristics to know one's previous births. But here we are talking about future and the knowledge of omens and the knowledge of foretelling signs. See, and then he goes into sanyama on friendliness will bestow one with many strengths in many areas. Not only biological and psychological, but also financial, social, and so on. Then he says, and this can be a very good way of self-development. You do sanyama on something and you develop that part of oneself. But Patanjali is not referring to ordinary development. He is referring to extraordinary development here. Sanyama on physical strength, that can be done directly either by sanyama on physical strength or any object that symbolizes physical strength like an elephant. That brings one the benefit of physical strength. So this is a very good instance where psychological work results in a physical result. It's the positive inverse of what we call conversion disorder. In conversion disorder, we have a psychological problem turning into a physical problem. And here we have a psychologically positive thing turning into something physically positive. Just put on some light. It's a strange kind of shadow and darkness. So he says, Sanyama on physical strength or any object of physical strength like an elephant. Hasti, referring to elephant, can give one physical strength. Sanyama on the origin and expanse of an action, one gets knowledge of the subtle, hidden and the distant. So if you take up any action, start at its origin in terms of its physical origin as well as thought origin, emotional origin, thought origin, karmic origin, and then see how from its origin the action has expanded into so many branches. So action begets another response, that response begets another response, and the whole tree of responses develops. So if one can go and do Sanyama on the origin and the whole tree of action of any particular action, take one action, go into its origin and see how that whole thing has expanded. Take for example, you are appearing for medical entrance or engineering entrance exam and you are studying, and that go into that action. How did you start studying? How did it start? And from there you can see you study well, you get into engineering, and then because you get into engineering, you get into X company, and then Y situation and Z events, and the whole tree develops. If you can take up one particular action and from its alpha to omega, plot it out, and then focus upon it and do Sanyama over it, you start getting knowledge about the subtle, the hidden, subtle, which is very ephemeral, not concrete, not gross, miniaturized, esoteric, right? But not hidden. And then you have things which are hidden inside of you and outside of you and inside of nature. And then distant, that which appears very distant to you. So you get knowledge about all. Sanyama on the sun brings knowledge about earth. Some people refer this as entire world. Samayat. Bhuva Gnanam, sorry. Bhuva is earth, Gnanam is knowledge. So Bhuva Gnanam, knowledge of earth. Some people translate this as knowledge of the entire world, meaning it covers knowledge about rivers, mountains, forests, seasons, agriculture, and so on. I have also seen some people translating Bhuva Gnanam, and Bhuva, they almost take it as a loka and they translate it to say knowledge of the cosmos. This translation also I have seen. But the safest is knowledge of the earth. All the features of the earth, broad characteristics of the earth, and we are of course talking about essential knowledge and not comprehensive knowledge. So this is the significance of doing the Sanyama on sun. So sun worship is very common in India, and that may be a popular way of preserving this real technique of doing the Sanyama on the sun. Apart from the Ayurvedic health benefits, that's a different thing altogether. So sun worship has many aspects. The health aspect, the spiritual aspect, the mystical aspect. One mystical aspect is this aspect of Sanyama. Sanyama is purely a mystical thing. These are subtle power, subtle knowledge on the way. It is pure mysticism. Sanyama. In order to make spiritual development, you don't have to do any Sanyama. These are all things on the way. If you are prescribing to the school of liberation in spirituality, you don't have to do any Sanyama. If you prescribe to the school of subscribe to the school of transformation, then you have to take a call whether to do it or not. And if to do it only under the guidance of somebody, or after you are firmly established in Samadhi. Come back and do it. But to get lost before attaining Samadhi is a risky proposition. Better not to do. In some cases, in some people's program of life, they have to do it even before they attain samadhi. So that's a different situation altogether. Sanyama on the moon brings knowledge of the arrangement of stars, nakshatra. This may have been the way astronomy partly would have developed without so much of instrumentation in ancient times. That there is a different way of knowing apart from the instruments. Modern science essentially is based upon instrumentation. But this is a completely different way of knowing altogether. And in philosophy, when we talk about the problem of knowledge and the problem of knowing, the whole idea of Sanyama creates a very different paradigm for knowing and also for knowledge and also for the known. Sanyama on the Dhruv pole star. Dhruv is the name of a star, the pole star, I should put it in. Dhruv is the Indian name for pole star, brings the knowledge about motion of stars. So this is a very different way of doing science altogether. It is science inside out, not outside in. You go inside to discover the outside. You don't go outside to discover inside. Sanyama on the navel chakra brings knowledge of the entire layout of the body. The navel chakra, some translate this as exactly the chakra on the navel. In some chakra systems, and there are many, there's no one chakra system. There are many different ways the chakra and the nadi arrangement is seen. Chakra is the energy wheel in the energy body, the coordinating center. You can see some of my videos on details of this. In Reiki and some of the other sciences which deal with the chakra and the nadi and the entire astral body, I have seen navel chakra translated as the chakra right on the navel. In the Reiki also it is used right on the navel, hara. In pranic healing and in many of the tantra texts, the navel chakra actually is spoken of as a solar plexus, 2 inches above the navel. So when he says do Sanyama, there is a controversy whether it's solar plexus or exactly the navel chakra. I think we can take exactly the navel chakra literally as it is, what he says, and proceed with that. So that brings the knowledge of the whole body. Different way of doing medicine and biology. Let us proceed to the next. We will not spend much on time on this because I myself don't have knowledge to really share and comment upon it. Sanyama on the pit of the throat, Vishuddha, brings mastery or freedom over hunger and thirst. Worth doing. If we figure out how to do it, we will solve most of the problems. Again, there is a controversy on Vishuddha chakra. Ordinarily, it is on the throat that we talk about Vishuddha chakra. And at the pit of the throat, we talk about the lower throat chakra. So this is lower throat chakra is not actually Vishuddha. Vishuddha is on the throat, but Some people translate it as Vishuddha, but let us go by what Patanjali says exactly. He says Kantha Kupe, so the pit of the throat. So let us take it pit of the throat. Let us not go into Vishuddha. But this is a translation I see in many books. Sayama on the Kurma Nadi brings stability. And this is very necessary for yogis who stand on one leg or who stand in very unstable positions for a long time. Kurma Nadi is one of the major nadis for pranic flow. So we have 7 major chakras and a few important nadis. Some people talk about 72, some people talk about 32. And then these nadis are the pipelines that carry prana. And Kurma Nadi is one of the main ones. Just as in anatomy, we have the vagus nerve, very important among different nerves. Here we have Kurma Nadi, very important among nadis. And Sayama on the Kurma Nadi brings stability. Sayama on the light in the center of the forehead brings one the vision of the Siddhas. This is worth practicing. Let me practice and come back. It's really interesting. One 40 is very important. Says attainments, foresight can all happen spontaneously as illumination also without any Sanyam. So in many cases, as you proceed on the spiritual path, these attainments happen without doing any Sanyam. But it's not necessary all of them should happen, or if anything happens, it should happen 100% very intensely. It cannot be mild or moderate, it can be. You can have 137 happening moderately, 139 happening mildly, 138 happening very intensely. Any kind of possibility is there. So they can happen spontaneously also. And in fact, they can happen through other paths also. If we go into other forms of yoga, where they don't go by Sayama, they go by different exercises, they still get the same results. So these results seem to be the junction endpoints that you can reach through various ways. And this is very important. Many people report spontaneous emergence of these powers. We see that in case of UG Krishnamurti also. All of it happens spontaneously, although he does not do any Sanyama. We can see similarly in the Ramakrishna Paramahansa's story also. Many powers appearing spontaneously. Sanyama on the heart center will reveal the nature of the chitta. We can loosely translate that as either mind or unconscious mind. Some yogic books translate chitta as the unconscious. The difference being the psychoanalytic unconscious is only of this birth, but the yogic unconscious is of this birth and prior incarnations. So they translate chitta as the unconscious mind. Some translate chitta as the whole of the mind, the unconscious, the conscious, the desiring mind, the sensual mind, all taken together. But at some locations, Patanjali makes a distinction between the senses and the unconscious mind, which uses the senses, or the whole of the mind, which uses the senses. So safe translation would be a mind. Some people will make it unconscious mind, but safe is the mind. Sayama on the heart center, and heart center here is right in the center of the chest, not the physical heart, right in the center of the chest. And this is the heart center of Reiki and acupressure. This is not the heart center of pranic healing. The pranic heart center is slightly above the Reiki heart center. And that is corresponding more to the hormonal gland which is there. It's slightly above the center of the chest. So the pranic healing heart center is different. we are referring to the exactly the center of the chest. Focus on there will reveal us the unconscious mind. This would be worth practicing. I will try it out because this is something very interesting to psychoanalysis. If this can be a good technique, we will be saved so many of sessions and so many of challenges in ISTDP. (142). The observer Purusha is different from the mind, and Sanyama on this difference brings one freedom from the ceaseless quest for gratification and gain true knowledge of it. This is very important. This actually is the root for many spiritual systems like Vipassana or Krishnamurti's choiceless self-awareness or Osho's techniques of awareness. That the observer Purusha, we realize, is different from the mind. And by mind, we mean the psychic apparatus involving thoughts and feelings. So if we realize that this ceaseless flow of thoughts and feelings is one thing, and there is an observer which is, there is ceaseless thoughts and feelings, there is an observer which is different from this. And once we know this difference, that there is this ceaseless thoughts and feelings, there is this Purusha observer, and the two are different. And if we focus upon this difference and do Sanyama on this difference, we get freedom from the ceaseless thoughts and feelings. We get true knowledge of the mind, the true spiritual knowledge of the mind, and we enter Samadhi. It is then that extraordinary faculties of premonition, knowing beforehand, clear audience, hearing what is ordinarily not possible to hear, subtle touch, clairvoyance, seeing something from future, a highly refined taste, which the aesthetic experience so intense and so esoteric, normally not possible. Extraordinary sensitivity to smell and extraordinary intuition, they all appear. These are all extraordinary faculties. So extraordinary faculties of all these areas, related to all these areas, they appear. When do they appear? After we get freedom from the ceaseless occurrence of ceaseless quest for gratifications, thoughts and feelings for gratification. Once we get this 142, once we accomplish 142, 143 appears. And then he starts cautioning us in 144. All these attainments that you have talked about in the last almost 20-25 sutras, all these attainments are extraordinary and powerful in ordinary life, but obstacle to the journey to Samadhi, the real goal. The real goal is not Sanyama or these extraordinary things you get from Sanyama. The real goal is Samadhi. So he says, these may be extraordinary, powerful, and very useful, but still they are an obstacle to the journey to Samadhi. Once you realize Samadhi, after that you can come back and cultivate all these powers and use with wisdom. Once the bondage of the 145 turns to a completely different topic, the topic of subtle body and the physical body, and how to separate the astral or the energy body. There are words about it: subtle body, energy body, astral body. They all mean the same thing. I mean, they don't mean the same thing, but they are used as synonyms, unfortunately. So in ordinary language, people use all these three words to get for the same thing, but actually they don't mean the same thing. So what we say is, we just stick to what Patanjali uses: Sukshma Sharira, subtle body. So he says the subtle body and the physical body, they are entangled together. It's like a adhesive, that the subtle body is stuck to the physical body with an adhesive. He says if you loosen that adhesive and loosen up the subtle body and its firm fusion into the physical body, if you separate the two, normally they are fused, but if you, they are like this, but if you separate the two and you loosen the bondage between them, the subtle body can move freely. And once this freedom of subtle body is practiced, one can enter another physical body. And this brings out fundamental questions of who are we? What is our constitution? What are our constituents? And there is a fundamental difference between psychoanalysis and Western science on one hand and yogic science on the other. I have dealt with it before, how in the yogic system, the human integer is seen as constituted of the physical body, energy body, emotional body, mental body, karmic body. Then you have the yin and yang, the Purusha and Prakriti, the Shiva and Shakti, and then the psychic being. That is how the structure is seen. And then on the top you have the central being. And these five bodies interpenetrate each other, and the coordination happens at the chakras. So this is how books describe the constitution of the human integer, and it's very different. And therefore it's very difficult to have a psychoanalytic commentary, because the anatomy of the human integer is different in psychoanalysis. Now he comes to the vayus. Vayus are the movement of air described in Ayurveda. So Ayurveda described 5 major movements of the air in the body. So Udana Vayu is that Vayu which is responsible for upward movement of air. It is responsible for exhalation. It is responsible for throwing out. It is responsible for some currents going from center to the top. So Udan is the upwardly moving Vayu. Mastery over the upwardly moving Vayu, those who are interested more can go into the 5 Vayus of Ayurveda. You can find it on Wikipedia, or you can find it on any good Ayurvedic text. Mastery over the Udan Vayu can bestow one the capability to float over water, walk unharmed over mud or thorns, and then the person can leave the body at will. This last line some people don't write as translation. One way to do this, I think it is in this sutra or some other sutra, where he's talking about mastery over Udan Vayu using Sanyama. 146 is talking about it. Mastery over Udan Vayu using Sanyama, and this Sanyama can be done either by focusing on Udan Vayu or also focusing upon some substances lighter than water, which float on water. Sanyama on those substances can also give the same result. So let us go further into the last part of this chapter. After Udan Vayu, he comes to second Vayu, the Saman Vayu. Saman Vayu, Udan Vayu is responsible for upward movement of things from center to upwards. That is Udan Vayu. Apan Vayu is that which is responsible for flow from center downwards. Saman Vayu is that which creates a balance. Mastery over Saman Vayu bestows radiance and effulgence. This is more like a Ayurvedic statement rather than a yogic statement, except that the mastery is through Sanyama. That is where Patanjali comes in. Otherwise, if you remove this part, just say mastery over Saman Vayu, that can be a statement in Ayurveda. Let me just put it here so it looks more of a yogic statement. Sanyama on the relationship between hearing and space. Some people translate this as ear and the space. I have put it the hearing and space bestows extraordinary ability of hearing, which may be hearing something far off, hearing sounds which otherwise cannot hear. Sanyama on the relationship between body and space and on the properties of substances like cotton that can float. Extraordinary ability to move in space can be achieved. So virtually is talking about flying with the body. So Sanyama between the body and the space. The focus has to be on the relationship between body and the space. If this focus is done, or you do Sanyama on properties of substances like cotton, substances that can float, properties of those substances which enable them to float. If you do Sanyama on that, ability to move in space can be achieved. Obviously, this is something which is possible only if Sanyama can be successfully done, and that can be done only if you are extraordinarily advanced in Dharana, Dhyana and Samadhi. Without that, you cannot do this Sanyama. So it's very difficult to really do a scale up of this thing. We cannot shut down the airlines and start moving in space by doing Sanyama, because it's beyond the capability of most individuals to really do this Sanyama of the type that Patanjali talks about. So we are talking here about a 1 in 100 million kind of possibility. Sorry. So we are talking here about a 1 in 100 million kind of possibility It is not a scale solution. These are all rare events. These are not predictably, ordinarily achievable scale type of events. You can scale it up. The point is, even if we can't scale it up, can we request and respect those few individuals who have this capability to really help us extend the reaches of our science? Whether they're ready or not, separate issue. When the ordinary tendencies of the mind go beyond body and the circumstances. The veil over the light is lifted and the self is revealed. So he says, when the ordinary tendencies of the mind, he's talking about a new normal. So rephrase it. When the concerns of the mind when the concerns of the mind go beyond the ordinary movements, the ordinary preoccupations with the body and our immediate circumstances, then sorry, then the veil over the light is lifted or thinned. Both translations I have seen, lifted and thinned. Some talk about made transparent. And then the self is revealed, either fully or partly, or at times one gets a full revelation, for sometimes very intense, and then again the self recedes and one goes back into the ordinary situation. That's also possible. In most cases that happens. Initially you have very intense experiences of the self, and then you get lost in the world again. The experience changes you forever, but you can get lost into the world quite easily again, especially if your program of life is such. Just give me 5 minutes, I'll take some meds and come back. Sanyama on the relationship between physical body and the subtle body leads one to the mastery on the elements, or rather elementals, I should say, the 5 bhutas, the 5 elementals. These elementals can have variety of meanings. Ordinarily, by this is meant earth, water, space, fire, and earth, water, air, fire, and space. 5. But some texts, they take this meaning differently. So they talk about in details further. So they say these are the 5 essential philosophical elementals. And then they go into the real existential elementals. And there they define elementals of the body, elementals of thinking, elementals of the emotional layer, elementals of the pranic layer, elementals of the karmic layer. So for all the 5 bodies, they define elementals. So we here accept, or rather what accept, we settle for what we can understand the best. It seems Patanjali is referring to Sanyama on relationship between physical body and the subtle body. That gives one the mastery on elementals, the Panchamahabhuta. And from there, the physical plenitude ensues. What is the physical plenitude include? It includes vigor, physical vigor, freedom from physical constraints, extraordinary physical abilities, including the 8 extraordinary capabilities. There is a very famous list of 8 extraordinary capabilities, and that includes Anima, Mahima, and things of that type, which means ability to miniaturize oneself, ability to expand one's physical form. It's basically a capability of multiplying one's physical form into a bigger form or a smaller form. And of course, it's something very difficult for us to believe because we have not seen any physical body in front of our eyes expanding or contracting. Even when we talk about regression, there is a psychological regression, there can be a cognitive regression, but never a biological regression. I mean, we don't regress from being 5.5 feet and go back to 2.5 feet. But this is something which says that even that is possible, not as a regression, but as a siddhi, as an attainment. Physical plenitude also includes beauty, strength, solidity, grace, and suppleness, and being as strong as diamond. All of this is possible by doing the sanyama over the relationship between the physical body and the subtle body. Sanyama over functional relationship between senses and experience can enable one mastery over senses. Sanyama over relationship between the senses and the experience the senses enable. That relationship between the two, if you do sanyama on that, it gives the mastery over senses. Then what happens? Senses work as swift as the mind. And we can use the senses even without the body organs. And this is very important. This tells us that at its root, the senses are not the same as the body organs which are used for those senses. So the sense of sight is not necessarily the same as the 2 eyes. It is different. It is using the 2 eyes. And in certain rare situations, it's possible not to use the 2 eyes and still have a sight. And this is what we see in rare mystical experiences. U.G. Krishnamurti talked about it, about a 360-degree vision, even when the eyes were closed. So this seems more to be the science of the future rather than just fantasy or psychosis or anything of that. In fact, that is true about the whole chapter. Very critically seen, looks like a compilation of fantasy and psychosis. Seen with respect, appears like the science of future. Then senses work as swift as mind, and use senses without the body, and a mastery over the foundation of oneself. With clear understanding of difference between the nature and the Purusha, one develops all essential knowledge on states of one's being. Essential knowledge on one's psychology of different states one enter into. That is known by knowing the difference between the nature, the Prakriti, and the Purusha. This is very common, and we have been saying it over and over again. That once we realize that our thoughts, our feelings, the whole nature, including sense stimulus, is on one side, and the observer is on the other side. Once we know the clear difference between the two, much of essential knowledge on our states of being becomes easy. Then Patanjali talks about entanglement with the siddhis. That many get entangled with the siddhis, all those powers described in this chapter. He says, once one is disentangled even from these powers, these extraordinary knowledge, extraordinary powers, extraordinary experiences, even they are entangling. And once you break free of that entanglement, true renunciation, true freedom sets in, and one enters into kaivalya or samadhi, the state of enlightenment. One should keep detachment and distance from these powers, lest one gets entangled again. So he is reiterating a word of caution related to this extraordinary and rare knowledge, power, experiences. So he has listed it out. He says, the rare, extraordinary experiences, knowledge, powers are possible. Here it is how it's possible. But don't get lost on that way. Keep it aside. Focus on the state of samadhi. From there, one is able to see similarity in seemingly different entities. Entities that seem different owing to their form, characteristics, or location in time. So we can see oneness behind diversity. Not as a cognitive concept, not as a politically correct statement. We are talking about deep experiential states. We are not talking about superficial statement making. So he says, when one sees the oneness behind what appears different, for example, you take a notebook and a pen, they look like two different entities. But if you go deeper, they are both made of atoms. And if you go deeper still, one may go into the experience of oneness with existence, where both of them are arising out of that same anchor of oneness, and therefore are connected through that same anchor of oneness. And there you go beyond the discrete different entities as they look different to us, but we realize in essence everything is one and connected. Such knowledge reveals that one has to go beyond the senses to completely understand the objects. The senses cannot give us the knowledge of oneness. That can only happen by deeper experience beyond the senses. Senses can only give us that two objects exist, and the senses tell us there is nothing between them, the two are separate. But science tells us they are interacting, and science tells us both are created of the same atomic structure. Senses don't tell us anything about the atoms. It's only when we use our minds and we go deeper, we realize that it is so. So unless the mind uses the senses and the mind operates on its own also, independent of the senses, knowledge beyond the senses is not possible. And that is very important knowledge. Much of the knowledge is hidden. Post-purification and knowledge of oneness between fundamental essence of nature and Purusha, Kaivalya happens. So he says again, he says the same thing, reiterates that when you know the oneness between the fundamental essence of the Purusha and the Prakriti, the observer and the observed, the subject and the object, Kaivalya or enlightenment happens. With this, we finish the third chapter of the book, Vibhuti Pada, and now we'll go into the fourth chapter, Kaivalya Pada or Samadhi Pada. Sorry, Kaivalya Pada. First is Samadhi Pada. And now we will have more commentary on the fourth chapter. The third chapter, you cannot do much commentary because he talks about those rare experiences, knowledge, and powers about which we don't really have enough knowledge to make a commentary upon. We can only make a note of it and try some of the experiments ourselves. These are very harmless experiments. These are essentially experiments of concentration, oneness, right? All internal experiments. And you do all the experiments just sitting peacefully. So they don't involve any expense, they don't involve any risk. All that you risk is your time. So it's better to experience these things and find out for oneself. Since I have not found out as yet, I will in some time. Then I'll be able to do a better commentary on this. But till then, let it be as a introduction to the third chapter in English terms. And we'll go now to the fourth chapter. And in the fourth chapter, like in the first and second chapter, we will have adequate discussions and commentary and referencing of a psychoanalytic standpoint to Yoga Sutras. Thank you.